But I want to begin with our panelist here to the right, Stephen Collis, who's going to read one of his poems.
Thank you. I also want to thank the Coast Salish people for having us here on their land today. So this is just going to read two very short pages, parts of a longish poem. It's from a book called The Commons. So that seems fitting. And it's actually from a poem called Dear Common Ya Basta, which was written about 6 years ago during a bilingual oral performance of the Sexta Declaration of the EZLN, I guess, that will be making that declaration. I think, Pablo, I think you were there, maybe performing that night, while I was sitting in the audience writing down things. Surveillance. This is our simple word. This is why we said enough. Thievery governments and the world. Joined forces silence. Beamed straight forests. Groves together willing boughs. Trained in politics and in weapons. Until we set aside the fire and took up words other lightnings. Through such as resisted well deceit of decaf and bad governments, mountain gorillas and drenching languages. I'll download your rebellion, but my virus makes actions properties, buying up the domains of freedom and surveilling the lines of defense. If there is to be civil society every abound, if uncivil we tamper with capital's course and communications sound, and if borders redesigned designer genes, if freight's deregulation informs, if cheap clothes and coffee is cool, then we take to the barricades voice. If elections, then electric communiques. If enclosed feasts, then hacking fences, firewalls. If tariffs, tools, then appropriating and disseminating. Calls against singleness and idle leisure, remote pleasures, properties. And if we are sold only singleness, then channel others' unending rage. So I want to talk about two kinds of commons, or two ways of conceiving the commons, as briefly as I can anyhow. One which I'll call the metabolic commons, and the other one what I'll call the future commons. And they're both very interrelated, but I'll try and explain a bit about what those are. So first of all, the idea of the metabolic commons. And I'm going off on a way Marx talks about metabolism in Capital, and that other writers have picked up Marx's use of the metaphor, ultimately, of metabolism to describe, in the end, the relationship between economy and ecology, or economy and environment. So this is the part from Marx in Capital. Labor is, first of all, a process between man and nature, a process by which man, through his own actions, mediates, regulates, and controls the metabolism between himself and nature. And this is David Harvey's gloss on that same passage. Sort of simplifies what Marx is saying in a way. We cannot transform what's going on around us without transforming ourselves. Conversely, we can't transform ourselves without transforming everything going on around us. This dialectic of perpetually transforming oneself by transforming the world and vice versa is fundamental to understand the evolution of human societies as well as the evolution of nature itself. So what is it to conceive of the economic, ecological interface as a metabolism? Well, for starters, it assumes those are two parts of one body that is being regulated, one organism, as it were. It makes economy and ecology absolutely inseparable. One mechanism is affecting, they're affecting each other simultaneously. We could look at the Greek origin, the root of both those words, which is oikos, which means home. So economy is how we make our living, in a very simplified sense, and ecology, the environment ultimately, is where we're making a living. Under a capitalist regime, that equation is more or less discounted out of hand. That is, economics always trumps environmental concerns. And so what we hear are things like, well, this project, if we go with it, this resource extraction project, will pump X number of billions of dollars into the economy. And people go, well, what about the environmental impacts of that? Well, they might throw a little bone out there of a little environmental review of some kind, but ultimately, when it comes down to it, the argument for economy is going to be used to trump and discount the argument for ecological impact. Obviously, we all know this story. What I'm curious about in terms of metabolism and the metabolism of turning our environments into our economic needs, satisfying our economic needs, are these different kinds of totalities that get trotted out for us. So one is obviously the market totality. What really matters is every year, what's the GDP, what percent did the market rise or fall by over this year, et cetera, et cetera. And we're used to seeing these vast abstract numbers in our mainstream media all the time. But what we don't see, and where I would want to insert the commons as a way of thinking about that social metabolism, as Marx calls it, what's the whole impact of what does that number really represent? What's really behind that number? So here's where the simplistic math comes in. Marx famously has these two equations, and essentially these are what he calls this is social metabolism at work. This CMC, you'll read Marx, they're familiar with this, and MCM. M being money, and C being commodity. So, and of course, both these assume a moneyed economy. Let's put that up here for starters. You know, most of us live our day-to-day lives up here at CMC. We make some sort of commodity or provide some sort of service. We get paid money, and then we go buy commodities or services we need, we require. Ultimately, Marx says you're in a loop of use values here. You provide something useful in order to get some things that are useful to you. In some ways, that old adage, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, maybe leaving money aside, would kind of fit in here. But so this isn't capitalism. And most of us in our day-to-day lives aren't operating as capitalists. Capitalism starts and ends with money. Of course, it ends with more money than it started with. So you insert money into the economy by hiring labor, buying means of production, producing commodities, which you then sell to get more money. So obviously we're in a loop of money, which is spiraling upward all the time. Marx adds a little at the end of one of the M's to show that, well, the whole point is to come back with more money, and then the surplus value can reinvest and keep growing. So all pretty simplistic Marxist math. But I was wondering what would happen if we inserted the idea of the commons in at C instead of commodity. So in part, what that would point to is that in a capitalist economy, the commons is bought up or enclosed and used to produce profit. But what if we had an economy based on a system that began and ended with the commons? So we acknowledge that, yes, we take from the commons in order to go through our material production and reproduction, which would be at M here. But then what if we ended up back at the commons so that it was maintained, preserved for other people to come in and also take from the commons, acquire what they need, but also not deplete the commons, which is what capitalism does. Now into the reedy part of what I'll say, the reading part. So, going over a little bit of what I said already, I suppose. What if we imagined an economic totality that begins and ends with the commons? A new version of this equation in Marx. Taken as a whole, all life, all production and reproduction begins in the commons. Intellectually, genetically, we inherit. We are gifted from past generations, from what already exists. This is, of course, what capitalist private property relations have long sought to obscure and deny. All that we depend upon, plants, animals, water, air, soil, knowledge, comes from a common fund. We transform that fund through our social metabolism, acquiring what we need to persist and even prosper. Finally, what if the goal of our economy or our social metabolism was to return to the commons, the final C here, so that the commons at the end of our social metabolism was just as healthy and full as a totality as it was at the beginning of our life process, thus giving the commons to future generations. So in a system that's managing energy flows via metabolism, having some kind of balance, maintaining a kind of level keel is ideal. This is not what capitalism does, obviously. This is what I'm calling the metabolic commons. It's the idea that the maintenance, health, and sustainability of the commons should be at the heart of our social metabolism. It's an idea based upon seeing economy and ecology, how we make our living and where we make our living, as the roots and branches of the same tree. It's an idea based on the complete inseparability of the social and the natural. An idea that we are simply part of a single large organism that is the biosphere. There only is an atmosphere we can breathe and soil from which all living things can grow, because in the past, living things have gone through their cycles of production and reproduction, life and death. At the most primary metabolic level, we, the totality of living beings, have built the commons upon which we all depend through our collective existences, through the course of history, through long cycles of living, dying, and evolving in metabolic exchange with our environments. So we all know this, right? There's only dirt because living stuff has died at some point. It is only in the past few centuries that we have had an economy whose mission appears to be to imbalance the metabolic commons and emaciate the future. The title of this conference indicates a strange irony. It's not the commons that tragically exceeded its limits of sustainability, as Hardin proposed in that essay, The Tragedy of the Commons, that we're ironically playing with here, but the market that has done so. I want now to give a fairly straightforward local example of the different totalities proposed by the market on the one side and the commons on the other, as they impact differently regulate the social metabolism. A recent Vancouver Sun article on the proposed Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline noted that, quote, the company and the federal government are pushing for approval, characterizing the project as a national imperative worth $270 billion to the Canadian economy over its lifetime. No comment on the length of that lifetime. This is a typical argument for the market, based on a conception of its contribution to the totality of the economy and leveraged against environmental concerns that could limit economic expansion in any way. What's completely missing from the bottom line figure invoked here, $270 billion, is who exactly receives what percentage of that total amount, and what environmental and social impacts or consequences will result from such staggering accumulation. A different picture of the totality of a project like the tar sands and its oil pipelines is addressed in another recent article in the Vancouver Observer. Quoting from that, the Greater Vancouver area is being flooded by several gigantic, uncontrolled, and rapidly expanding flows of carbon. All of Vancouverites' efforts to reduce climate emissions in the next decade will be wiped out 100 times over if these local, out-of-control carbon flows are allowed to expand as planned. So this is the Kinder Morgan plant on Burrard Inlet, and our plant, so where we're at anyhow, and the coal docks out in Delta. The point here is imbalance in the metabolic commons, and the totality reference is atmospheric. The carbon our economy is pumping into the whole biosphere. The uneven development of big projects and their highly touted billion-dollar economic contributions is also at the center of this article. It's big oil and big coal, with their planned port expansions and astronomical profit projections, who are supplying the lion's share of Vancouver's carbon contribution, as well as doing everything they can to avoid paying for the social and environmental damages they are causing, while other smaller contributors, like the City of Vancouver itself, do pay carbon taxes and endeavor to cut their carbon emissions. This is part of the so-called making Vancouver the greenest city in the world, right? Perhaps the crucial implication of the sort of metabolic commons I'm talking about here comes from a recent Tsleil-Waututh Nation press release. Again, the issue is the presence and proposed expansion of oil in our local environment. The press release reads, in part, "I think it's fair to ask the question, who speaks for Burrard Inlet?" said Chief George. "We take our responsibility for stewardship seriously, but Tsleil-Waututh cannot do it alone. We need the citizens of Metro Vancouver and their local government representatives to get angry and take action over what we can only conclude is irresponsible corporate citizenship and ineffectual government regulation." Chief George concluded, "If you want a glimpse of the future, look at what's happening at present and in our immediate past. 15,000 barrels of oil spilled into the inlet in the space of less than an hour in 2007. If we continue to allow unregulated industrialization of our backyard, our grandchildren will be lighting fires on the waters of Burrard Inlet." The notions of responsibility and stewardship Chief George speaks to here are part and parcel of a traditional First Nation sense of the economic, ecological matrix I'm calling the metabolic commons. The idea that how you make your living and where you make your living need to be in balance and be sustainable. I turn now to another kind of commons, that other commons I mentioned are the future commons, which Chief George also directs our attention to. In some senses, the future is the ultimate commons, as yet unclaimed, unowned in its entirety, despite leases, titles, and patents, which attempt to enclose the future. If we are to persist as a society or civilization or a species, that persistence will by definition depend upon and we will all need access to an open future. In a sense, the placing of present gain before future consequences, upon which capitalism's model is based, is already attempting to enclose the future before it arrives. What we require to avoid this real tragedy of the market is exactly what the market system disallows, but which Chief George and the Tsleil-Waututh are calling for: transgenerational thought and planning. We need a social metabolism that does not rob us of a common future. It's in this context of the future commons that I would like to conclude with a few remarks on the Occupy movement. I've written elsewhere that the real demand or claim the Occupy movement is asserting is a right to the future. I see this in part in the way the movement has instantly and spontaneously seized hold of public space and, idealistically, without a great deal of planning or forethought, refused to carry the work of an unsustainable system into the future. It is a movement largely of young people who have their futures ahead of them, and a movement that is built upon sitting down and standing up now, without further delay, to fashion a new and better future. Thus, the Occupy movement remains a movement of potentiality, a movement in a state of potentiality. I'm encouraged by the fact that its main ambit or accomplishment so far has been one of opening possibilities for change and resistance, and for laying a political claim to the very idea of the potential in the future. So there's a real chance to place the idea of the common, the idea of balanced, shared, and sustained relations between our economies and our environments at the heart of the world the Occupy movement might struggle for. However, the movement has suffered in some ways because of its unfortunate name, which has sunk in and spread wildly in the past few months, and in its related failure to adequately address and find ways of working in solidarity with existing struggles, particularly Indigenous struggles. These two issues, the name Occupy, solidarity with Indigenous struggles, are obviously completely intertwined and have resulted in calls to rebrand the movement with the word decolonize, as in decolonize Portland, decolonize Vancouver, and Occupy. First Nations peoples have long had their traditional territories occupied. How will this new occupation be any different? My hope is that with the movement still so very much in a state of potential, and with it looking squarely towards a shared or common future, it can indeed respond to this very crucial critique and move forward by decolonizing and commoning. In a recent article, Decolonizing Together, Harsha Walia writes that decolonization is as much a process as a goal. It requires a profound recentering on Indigenous worldviews. Syed Hassan, a Toronto-based activist, states, decolonization is a dramatic reimagining of relationships with land, people, and the state. Much of this requires study. It requires conversation. It is a practice. It is an unlearning. Even if the Occupy movement is not able to rebrand itself at this point, it still needs to undergo this profound recentering on Indigenous worldviews. Worldviews, as Harsha notes, which are premised on revolutionary notions of respectful coexistence and stewardship of the land. It also needs to engage in some serious unlearning, which could, I hope, turn the movement into one of unoccupying. Because this is exactly what a movement towards, and in the name of, a future commons must do. It must release the land we occupy from the chokehold of colonization, privatization, and resource extraction, and allow the commons to do the work it is meant to do, regulate the metabolism of our economies and environments so that life may persist into the future. I think this is also crucial as the meme of occupying proliferates. It's not too hard to imagine occupying Wall Street. You foreclose us, we'll foreclose you. But what would it mean to occupy the tar sands or to occupy a resource like oil? In the instance of resource industries, which are directly damaging the common environment we all depend upon, what we need, again, is not an occupation, but an unoccupation, an abandoning of destructive and unsustainable industries, a leaving of the damn oil in the ground. And this is a leaving of the future open to as yet undreamt possibilities. The road ahead is one of decolonizing and commoning, and that's where we need to begin. Thank you.